Okay, well, hopefully you thoroughly understand the Milgram study as far as it was designed, and then also saw evidence that, the people who were doing the shocking, they did not feel good about it. A lot of people thought that, if you would be willing to shock a person, you would kind of enjoy it. But I think you could see that, people were very conflicted. Their desire to obey the authority figure, combined with their desire to not harm another person, was making them very conflicted. So it's really important to know that about the Milgram study. A lot of people see it as like maybe people sort of happily shocking other people, and that's not at all how it was. So I think the best way to understand why and how we get to a place where 2/3 of people were willing to shock is we really have to look at those factors that enhance obedience, and we really have to look at those factors that reduce obedience. One of the biggest factors that make it more likely that a person will obey even beyond the 2/3 that we saw in the Milgram study is if the teacher doesn't have to be the ones directly doing the shocking. So in the Milgram study, 2/3 of people were willing to shock when, instead of having to do the shocking themselves, the teacher had the opportunity to say, oh, he got it wrong, you push the button and shock him. Then they got compliance or obedience to go up to 80-85%. So my hands don't have to get dirty. I'm much more willing to obey. So so basically, if you can get the person to separate out from their own personal responsibility for the actual harm that they're doing, you can get more obedience from the teacher. But I think the best insight into why people comply is to look at situations when they don't. When people, I should have said obey, when people obey versus when they don't. So if you have, for example, a non-authority figure telling you to harm someone else, just a peer tells you to do it, that reduces the likelihood of obedience significantly. So there's something about the fact that experimenter was a pseudo-authority figure, right? Here they are, a researcher in the original study. Here they are, a researcher appearing apparently at Yale University. I live in New Haven. I know the prestige of Yale. So there was something about that person actually having authority that made people obey. There was something about the prestige of the place, right? If instead of conducting the study at Yale University, it was conducted in a rundown office, which was one of the replications, you can see that obedience went down. So there was something about, you wouldn't go to Yale University and shock someone to death, right? I mean, that's not what's happening here. If you, as the teacher, instead of getting to push a button and somebody in another room yells out, if instead you have to take that learner's hand and force it onto a plate that will shock them, that reduces obedience. There's something much more empathetic that's going on here, where I have to actually physically force you to experience what you're supposed to be experiencing. I'd like to point out, they should have figured out no shocking was going on when they themselves were not getting shocked, but maybe people don't understand that if you're holding the hand of somebody who is getting shocked, you're getting shocked too. But if I have to force your hand and make you experience the pain, I'm probably not going to do it. If there are other people who are part of the study who are also supposed to be teachers, who are supposed to be doing their own little punishment on their learner, and they refuse, and you see that, it makes you more likely to refuse also. So when you see that the Confederate can stand up to the researcher and say, I'm not going to do that, it makes it more likely that you'll also not do it. Finally, these are all replications where they really were trying to figure out what factors go into obedience. If an experimenter calls on the phone instead of being in the room with the teacher, so instead of being right there 2 steps away, I call you and I say, the experiment demands that you continue. It's much easier to tell that distant researcher, you know what? I'm not doing this anymore. So these are some of the follow-ups that Milgram conducted that showed those situations when obedience goes down, which really illustrates the factors that were important in getting that 2/3 obedience. So, having an authority figure in a place with prestige, having a little bit of separation from the learner and good proximity to the researcher, these are factors that all seem to be super important for obedience. I thought I'd share with you another study that was conducted by some other researchers, because one of the most common complaints about the Milgram study is that it's artificial. There is no way, goes this criticism, that people think that they went down to Yale University and went into a psychology lab and potentially were going to shock someone to death. That there is no way that they thought that authority figure would tell them to do that. So a study was conducted at a hospital in 1968, I believe was the correct year, where this hospital had a policy that said that nurses were not to administer medication without a signature from a doctor. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as I tell you the rest of the study. So these ER nurses were approached and asked if they would be willing to participate in a psychological study, and they were not told anything about what it would entail. They were just told it will happen here in the ER. You won't know that it's the study until we tell you that was the study. Are you willing to participate? So, a number of them agreed. So one of the first complaints is, was that very ethical to not tell them at all what's going to happen and then get them to agree? Like, that wasn't really very informed consent. But anyway. So one day they're working and a patient comes in an ambulance and they are just freaking out. Now, it turns out it's an actor pretending to freak out. The nurse calls up to psychiatry for a consult, and they get this new psychiatrist who's only been here, a couple of weeks, coincidentally, because the psychiatrist was part of the study and was pretending to be a psychiatrist. So the psychiatrist says, okay, I'm coming down. I want you to get him started on 12 milligrams of Astrotet. I want him medicated when I get down there, and hangs up the phone. Now remember, this is 1968. There's no beeper. There's no follow-up. If he's hung up the phone, you're not seeing him until he's down here. You cannot communicate with him until he arrives. So this is the big obedience point. Do the nurses follow this doctor's orders and administer the Astrotet, or do they follow the hospital policy and refuse to administer it until they have a signature from the doctor? Well, the easy answer to that question is 100% we're going to violate the hospital policy. 100% of them went to the drug cabinet and got out the vial of Astrotet. Now, Astrotet is a very uncommon medication, and so the nurses none of them were familiar with it. And so each of them, removed it from the medicine cabinet and then read the label, right? And the label says on it not to administer more than 3 milligrams per day, but the doctor had ordered 12. So this is their next decision point. Do I obey what the doctor says and administer 12? Or do I administer 3 like the label says? Or do I just now decide, you know what, I am going to wait because this doesn't make sense. I'm not doing this. Well, of the ones who were going to administer the 12 milligrams, that was 2/3 of the nurses. 2/3 of the nurses were in the process of preparing to inject 12 milligrams of Astrotet when they were told this was the experiment. Stop, don't really inject that. He's not really freaking out. Patient's fine. Interesting that it was 2/3, don't you think? Because that's exactly the same number that Milgram got. So the argument that it was obtained only because it was such a fake situation and everybody knew it wasn't real doesn't really stand up in the face of studies like that one, where it was eminently real. The nurses literally thought that this patient needed medication. What was really interesting is that the nurse research showed that same issue about, the experimenter calling on the phone. Think of the hospital as the experimenter who had said, don't administer medication without a doctor's signature. Well, the hospital policy is pretty distant, isn't it? You've got a psychiatrist coming down here who probably is going to be upset if you haven't started the drug. And that's what a lot of the nurses said in the debrief, is that if you don't do what the doctors say, they get really mad. And that's why 100% of us, we're going to violate the hospital policy and administer a drug without a signature. The doctors get mad if we don't. And so the doctors feel a lot more present than the hospital policy does. And so instead of following the policy as the authority, they were willing to follow the doctor as the authority. So lots of different variations on testing Milgram's study have been conducted. They've done it where the person supposedly is shocking a puppy. Interestingly, people are less likely to shock a puppy than another human. Even though it was so clear to the teacher that it, through a flip of the draw, could have been him getting the shock, they seem to lose empathy for the person who's in there getting shocked and think, well, too bad for them. Luckily it's not me. I'm kind of sorry I'm doing this to you, but it's not me. Whereas with a puppy, for some reason, they don't have that kind of empathy. And don't worry, no puppies were harmed. Nobody was ever harmed in any of these studies. The only person who ever got harmed was the teacher when they got that initial shock to make them believe it was really, there was really electricity. So lots of different variations have shown us that, when in doubt, we tend to follow what an authority figure tells us to do. And that there are certain very specific circumstances where we can reduce that obedience and boost that sort of, non-compliance that we all think we probably would do. When I was an undergraduate, we had to read the Milgram study for my English class and discuss it in groups of, I think, 6. And everybody in the group said, oh, I wouldn't shock a person at all. And I'm like, okay, I'm a psych major, and I'm going to say 2/3 of us would. I don't know if it would be me or not. I don't know. I've never been in a circumstance where an evil authority figure is telling me to do something harmful to somebody else. I'm going to finish this conversation with some happy news about obedience. Can you imagine if we all decided we're not going to obey legal and legitimate authorities? What if you've been watching a whole bunch of the British show where they all drive around in different cars? Oh my gosh, what's the name of it? Well, anyway, you've been watching British shows where people are driving around in cars on what I would consider the wrong side of the road, right? They're on the left side. And you're like, man, that is so cool that they drive on that side of the road. I'm going to do that from now on. Here in the U.S., I'm going to drive on the left side of the road. Can you imagine if you just decided, who are you to tell me I drive on the right side of the road? I like the left. I think it's better. And so you just start doing it. Can you imagine the anarchy that we'd have if people just did whatever they wanted to do all the time? I mean, if we didn't have this sense that authority figures can make certain rules and regulations for all of us to follow, we would have a lot of difficulty, living in society. So generally, the authority asking us to obey things has our best interest at heart, or society's best interest at heart, or evidence and science and things like that to back up the reasons for why they would make this request of us or this demand of us. And it's for the greater good that we follow those rules. But I can agree with Milgram the issue of there are times, absolutely, when, disobedience is the correct response. When, things are happening that people need to say no and stand up. And so, for example, Nazi atrocities being a great example, right? Stand up and say, no, I'm not going to do it. Now, that's great. Great for you to think that, Milgram, but when one of the, going back to Raven's bases of power, if one of the bases of power is the ability to punish you, and that punishment could range from killing the people who you care about to killing you to, if the person with the power has that kind of power, you could see where it would be very difficult to disobey, right? You can imagine that you're just hoping to get through this with, your life or the lives of your loved ones still intact, right? Like you can imagine so it's never as simple as just sitting back and saying, oh, I would never do that. The context can really have a big impact on the behaviors we would actually engage in. All right, that concludes chapter 6, so I will see you in chapter 7.